Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wanted to know about music. So whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place, so stick with us. Now, in today's episode, I thought it would be interesting to explore the other side of music. Its historical uses as propaganda and for manipulation. Now, I have an interest in, of course, the benefits of music and its overwhelming capacity for good, but I also am fascinated by the dark side of music and its use for, well, not so good. Music has been used not just for entertainment, but as a powerful tool of influence, often used to shape public emotions in times of war and political unrest. It's like a double-edged sword, a force for unity and resistance, but also a tool for manipulation and control. So let's get into this rabbit hole of a topic. I guarantee that you're going to learn something crazy today. So, music. It's the soundtrack to our lives. It lifts us up when we're down, it brings us together at concerts, weddings, even on the dance floor. It can feel personal, intimate, like it's just for us. But music can also be something more powerful, something weaponized. Throughout history, music has been used to unite people, but also to divide them, to inspire hope and to instill fear. It has the power to move nations to pride or to violence. In times of war and political upheaval, music becomes more than just entertainment. It becomes a tool for propaganda. And the strange thing is, we're often not even aware of it. Music can shape what we believe, who we trust, and who we fear. Now, before we get into the role that music plays, let's get clear on something first. What is propaganda? We hear that word a lot, and maybe even throw it around when we disagree with someone's opinion. But at its core, propaganda is much more than just persuasion or bias. Propaganda is information, often heavily biased or misleading, that's designed to promote a particular political cause or ideology. But it's not always a flat-out lie. Sometimes it is the truth, but told in a way that's carefully crafted to influence how we feel, think, and act. It can show up in speeches, posters, news reports, and, well, music. And that's because music isn't just background noise. It's a delivery system for emotion, and emotions are the engine of propaganda. Now, I remember studying propaganda in school, and we were always showed these posters and campaigns, but music is often overlooked. Propaganda also isn't inherently good or bad. It depends on who's using it and for what purpose. But one thing is clear. When you add music to the mix, it becomes an incredibly powerful tool because while facts make us think, music makes us feel. Now, music works so well as propaganda because of the way that it interacts with our brains. When we listen to music, it activates multiple regions of the brain simultaneously. One of the key areas involved is the limbic system, which governs emotions, memory, and motivation. In particular, the amygdala processes the emotional intensity of music, while the hippocampus links it to memory. Meanwhile, music stimulates the release of neurotransmitters like dopamine, which is associated with reward and pleasure. And this neurochemical cocktail explains why music feels so emotionally charged, and why it can be such an effective vehicle for influencing us. But the effects of music on the brain go beyond simply making us feel good. Studies show that rhythmic elements of music can entrain our physiological states, and this basically means that we become in sync with the music. For example, research on rhythmic entrainment demonstrates how music can synchronize our heart rates and breathing patterns. So marches, chants, and anthems often make use of steady tempos and rhythmic repetition because they can physically synchronize groups of people, creating a sense of unity and collective identity at a deep, embodied level. Sociologist Tia Denora, in her influential book called Music in Everyday Life, describes music as technology of the self, a tool for shaping emotions, behavior, and social situations. She highlights that music helps to structure experience and behavior, making certain emotional and physical states more likely to occur. In other words, music doesn't just reflect social orders, it helps to create them. And when institutions harness this power, whether states, movements, or organizations, they can use music to regulate public emotion on a mass scale. From a psychological perspective, music's ability to influence emotions makes it an ideal medium for emotional priming, which is the process of evoking a particular feeling to prepare someone to receive a message in a certain way. A 2010 study demonstrated how background music in political advertising could prime viewers' emotions, subtly shifting their perceptions of political candidates without them being consciously aware of it. Now, here's a creepy example. There's evidence that Nazi rallies used specific sound frequencies to manipulate the crowd. Before Hitler came on stage, they would play a low, unsettling hum, something around 15 to 17 hertz. And that's a frequency just low enough to make you feel physically uncomfortable or anxious without realizing why. And then the moment that he walked out, they would cut the sound. And suddenly, silence. But it wasn't just quiet, it was relief. And that relief got subconsciously associated with his presence. Clever, right? I mean, sinister, yet effective. And this is an example of emotional priming. You prime someone to feel something, whether it's fear, hope, or unity, and then deliver your message when they're the most emotionally vulnerable. And music is the perfect primer. Propaganda needs to bypass our critical thinking and go straight for the gut, and music does that better than anything else. Music also has the ability to foster social identity, which is a sense of belonging to a group, nation, or movement. According to social identity theory, people derive part of their self-concept from group membership, and music plays a key role here. Think national anthems, revolutionary songs, and protest music. They all reinforce group boundaries by evoking shared emotions and values. Research suggests that musical preferences often reflect and reinforce group identities, creating emotional bonds that strengthen in-group solidarity and out-group hostility. Now, I spoke about this in episode 4 on music and personality, as it explains why we take insults on our music tastes so personally. And it also explains why, since the beginning of human civilization, music has been used as a device to control social behavior, where it's operated to both promote solidarity within groups and hostility between competing groups. Repetition also plays an important role in how propaganda works, and music is fundamentally repetitive. Cognitive psychology tells us that repetition facilitates memory consolidation, helping to embed information more deeply into long-term memory. Music, with its built-in repetition through choruses and refrains, ensures that messages are not just heard but remembered, sometimes for life. And in propaganda, repeated slogans or ideological messages are often set to music because it increases their recall and emotional salience. Think of how many people can sing the words to a national anthem they haven't heard in years. The tune acts as a mnemonic device, but also as an emotional trigger, activating feelings of pride, belonging, or even aggression, depending on the context. Another mechanism at play is collective synchronization, which is a concept that's been explored by ethnomusicologists and neuroscientists alike. When people sing, chant, or march together in time with music, their bodies and emotions sync up. A study found that shared musical experiences can produce increased feelings of empathy and connection, even between strangers. Think about concerts. Think about that feeling that we walk away with, this intense sense of connection and euphoric feeling. It's all about being part of something bigger and sharing that experience with a crowd of people that you don't know. It's just something that you can't compare to. But on a larger scale, this synchronization can be harnessed to create a sense of unity and shared purpose, sometimes for liberation, but sometimes for control. And finally, music's impact on cognition highlights its potential as a tool for manipulation. Studies on something called the dual process theory show that when we're emotionally aroused, we're more likely to rely on intuitive, automatic thinking rather than slow, reflective reasoning. Music, especially when it evokes strong emotions, can push us into this more reactive mode of thinking, reducing our capacity for critical analysis. Propaganda often seeks to overwhelm the rational mind with emotional appeals, and music is one of the most effective ways to do that. So, whether it's a military anthem, a freedom song, or even the soundtrack behind a campaign ad, music helps people feel part of something bigger. It creates unity, stirs identity, and it makes ideologies feel personal. That's why regimes, movements, and revolutions have always relied on music, not just as a soundtrack, but almost as a weapon. Now, let's travel back in time to some real-world examples of how music has been used to manipulate during times of political unrest or war. Starting off with what I think is one of the most known examples, World War II. Now, during World War II, music became one of the most effective tools in the propaganda arsenals of both Axis and Allied powers. In case you need a history reminder, the Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allied powers were led by Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Governments on both sides of the conflict recognized that music had the power to influence emotion, reinforce ideology, and strengthen national identity. It could be used to boost morale, demonize the enemy, or inspire loyalty and unity. And at times, it slipped beyond the grasp of those trying to control it, finding its way into the hearts of soldiers and civilians alike, regardless of which side they fought for. Perhaps one of the most infamous examples of music as propaganda comes from Nazi Germany. The Nazi regime understood the emotional pull of music and weaponized it to build a sense of German nationalism, racial superiority, and loyalty. In Nazi Germany, the use of music was tightly controlled by Joseph Goebbels and the Ministry of Propaganda. Goebbels understood that music wasn't just entertainment, it was a direct channel to the soul, capable of reinforcing Nazi ideology and shaping public consciousness. The regime promoted works that aligned with its ideals of Aryan purity, strength, and nationalism. At the same time, it ruthlessly censored and banned music that did not fit its racial or political criteria. One of the most striking examples of this was the embrace of Richard Wagner's music. Wagner, who had died decades before the Nazi regime even came to power, was held up as the epitome of German cultural superiority. His operas were steeped in mythological Germanic themes, celebrating the supposed heroism and destiny of a pure Aryan race. Wagner's music became emblematic of the Nazi vision. Hitler himself was an admirer of Wagner, and his operas were often performed at party rallies and state events to reinforce the narrative of German supremacy and cultural dominance. While Wagner's works were celebrated, jazz and swing were labeled as, quite literally, degenerate music. These genres were associated with African American musicians, and their rhythmic freedom and improvisation clashed with the rigid nature of Nazi ideology. As a result, they were banned from public performance and broadcast, but despite these bans, there was an underground appetite for jazz in Germany. Swing clubs emerged in secret, particularly among youth subcultures who embraced jazz as a quiet act of rebellion against the regime. One of the most interesting and revealing examples of music's power to transcend propaganda during the war was the song Lili Marleen. Originally a German love song recorded in the late 30s, Lili Marleen became an unlikely hit on both sides of the conflict. It tells a story of a soldier dreaming of his love, standing beneath a lantern outside his barracks. Despite its origin in Nazi Germany, the song found a profound resonance with the Allied soldiers, who tuned in to Axis broadcasts just to hear it. Radio Belgrade played the song nightly, and soon it became an anthem for troops on both sides, each group finding comfort in its simple, human longing. This phenomenon highlighted a paradox. While music was weaponized for propaganda, it also retained an unpredictable emotional force that could unify rather than divide. On the Allied side, Britain and the United States also employed music as an essential part of their propaganda and morale-building strategies. In Britain, the BBC broadcast carefully curated music programmes designed to reinforce resilience and national pride. One of the most iconic figures of this effort was Vera Lynn. She is known as the Force's sweetheart, and Lynn's songs provided comfort to soldiers abroad and those enduring the Blitz at home. Her signature song, We'll Meet Again, became a beacon of hope and reassurance. The lyrics promised reunion and peace at a time when both seemed impossible. Her broadcasts over the BBC helped maintain morale, binding the nation together through a shared emotional experience. In the United States, music was similarly used to rally public support and reinforce patriotic sentiment. Big band music, swing, and jazz were widely broadcast to convey a sense of optimism and American vitality. Psychological research conducted during and after the war supported the effectiveness of these musical campaigns. Studies found that music tied to national identity and pride could significantly increase feelings of loyalty, unity, and determination. Music provided emotional reinforcement for propaganda messages, strengthening social cohesion in times of uncertainty and fear. So, World War II demonstrated not just that music could be used as a weapon of influence, but also that its effects could be unpredictable. Even when carefully controlled, music often crossed boundaries and undermined ideological barriers, revealing its deeper, more universal appeal. Now, if World War II was the era of music as overt propaganda, the Cold War marked a more subtle yet equally powerful use of music as a tool of soft power. In a conflict defined by ideology rather than direct military engagement, both the Soviet Union and the United States recognized that music could be a potent weapon in the battle for hearts and minds. The Cold War's cultural front was fought in concert halls, jazz clubs, and on crackling radio broadcasts that crossed the Iron Curtain. In the Soviet Union, cultural policy was dominated by the need to protect the ideological purity of the communist state. Western music, particularly jazz, rock, and later pop, was seen as a corrupting influence. It represented capitalism, moral decay, and rebellion. As a result, much of it was banned or heavily restricted. And in its place, the Soviet government promoted state-sponsored classical music, which was intended to reflect socialist realism, art that was accessible, heroic, and ideologically sound. Composers like Dmitri Shostakovich navigated a complex relationship with the regime. His works were celebrated when they aligned with state expectations, but denounced when they were perceived as subversive. Initially hailed as a Soviet hero, Shostakovich quickly became a symbol of Soviet cultural achievement. However, his career was defined by a constant tension between his artistic vision and the political pressures of living under Stalin's rule. Throughout his career, Shostakovich faced intense scrutiny and fear of persecution. In 1936, after the premiere of his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, he was publicly denounced in the Pravda newspaper, a consequence of Stalin's personal disapproval. This led to years of fear and uncertainty, with Shostakovich keeping a suitcase packed by his door, anticipating possible arrest. In response, he adjusted his compositions to fit the government's demands for music that promoted Soviet ideals. His Fifth Symphony, for example, was seen as a re-education piece, a response to the earlier criticism that blended compliance with coded resistance. At the height of the Cold War, it was fashionable among Western critics to bash Shostakovich. He was, they claimed, a morally weak composer who had been forced to sacrifice his creative individuality in order to survive the oppressive demands of the Soviet system. But despite his public works aligning with the regime, Shostakovich often imbued his music with subtle critiques of the system, creating a double life as both a state-approved composer and a critic. The fear of arrest, or worse, constantly loomed over him, and this anxiety was reflected in the tension present in his music. His works, while seemingly fitting the expectations of socialist realism, often carried hidden, subversive messages that hinted at the emotional and psychological toll of living under a totalitarian regime. This complicated dynamic between state approval and artistic freedom defined Shostakovich's career, making him a figure both celebrated and persecuted, one who balanced survival with artistic expression, always walking a fine line between compliance and quiet resistance. Meanwhile, the Soviet state promoted military marches and grand symphonic works that celebrated collectivism, heroism, and the glory of the socialist project. These pieces were performed at official functions, broadcast over state radio, and used to reinforce reverence for the regime. Shostakovich himself composed film scores, patriotic songs, and public works that met these expectations, though whether he did so out of genuine belief or survival instinct remains a matter of debate. But once again, the allure of Western music was hard to contain. Despite bans, people found ways to access forbidden sounds. Jazz in particular held a deep fascination. It represented freedom, improvisation, and individual expression, the very qualities that the Soviet states sought to suppress. Underground jazz scenes once again flourished in cities like Moscow and Leningrad, often at great personal risk to those involved. The United States understood the power of this appeal and sought to capitalize on it. In one of the most ambitious cultural diplomacy initiatives of the era, the US government launched the Jazz Ambassadors Program. Beginning in the 1950s, leading African-American jazz musicians, including Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Benny Goodman, were sent on global tours as representatives of American culture. The program was backed by the CIA and aimed to showcase the values of freedom and creativity that jazz embodied. These musicians performed in countries across Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe, often in regions where the US was competing with the Soviet Union for influence. Jazz was promoted as a universal language of democracy and artistic freedom. Louis Armstrong's tour of the Congo and Dizzy Gillespie's performances in the Middle East became legendary, not just for their musical brilliance, but also for their political significance. Jazz was a living, breathing rebuttal to Soviet claims of American cultural decay. Now, I just want to derail things a bit here to talk about this aspect of jazz music. Jazz has a long and complex history of being labeled as a genre that shouldn't be listened to. From its earliest days, it was seen by many as dangerous, subversive, and morally corrupting. But why? What is it about jazz that has made it so controversial in certain societies? Well, at its core, jazz is a music of rebellion. It was born in the early 20th century from African-American communities in New Orleans, blending African rhythms, blues, ragtime, and European harmonies. It broke the rules of classical music's rigid structures, embracing improvisation, spontaneity, and emotional expression. For many, this freedom represented not just a new sound, but a direct challenge to social and cultural norms. In the early 1900s, jazz was often linked to speakeasies, gambling, and loose morals during the Prohibition era in the United States. The dance halls and clubs where jazz thrived were racially integrated spaces at a time when segregation was the law of the land. Jazz's association with Black culture, interracial socializing, and sexual liberation made it a target for those who wanted to preserve traditional values. Critics often described it as the devil's music, corrupting the youth and promoting vice. But this suspicion of jazz wasn't just confined to America, as we can see. Across Europe and in authoritarian regimes, jazz was treated with similar disdain. As we discussed, the Nazis banned jazz, labeling it as degenerate music because of its African and Jewish roots. They saw it as the embodiment of cultural decay, wild, undisciplined, and fundamentally un-German. And Soviet Russia too banned jazz for much of its history, viewing it as a corrupt Western influence that could undermine socialist ideals. In both cases, jazz was seen as music that encouraged individualism and free thought, qualities that totalitarian states found threatening. Even outside of politics, jazz has often been misunderstood. Its complex harmonies and improvisational nature can be challenging for listeners used to predictable melodies and simple rhythms. For some, jazz can feel chaotic or disorienting, but that unpredictability is precisely what makes it revolutionary. It resists control and conformity, and that's the irony. The very things that made jazz feared are the same things that have made it beloved by those seeking freedom, creativity, and self-expression. Jazz has always stood for something bigger than music. It's a symbol of resistance against oppression, an anthem for individuality, and a reminder that some of the most beautiful things emerge from breaking the rules. So when you hear about jazz as dangerous or unacceptable, it's often because it represents a challenge, whether to authority, tradition, or the status quo. Now, back to the Cold War. At the same time, in East Germany and other parts of the Eastern Bloc, Western rock music became the soundtrack of resistance. Young people in East Berlin were hungry for music that defied the constraints of their government. Bands like the Scorpions and Western icons like David Bowie became symbols of freedom and rebellion. Bootleg recordings and smuggled tapes circulated widely. In 1987, David Bowie famously performed a concert near the Berlin Wall, drawing huge crowds from both sides. Many East Germans gathered near the wall to listen, and some credit that concert as one of the cultural moments that fueled the growing unrest against the regime. Western rock and pop music offered an alternate vision of life, one based on personal freedom, individuality, and expression. As protests and uprisings grew in the late 80s, music became a rallying cry. Songs like the Scorpions' Wind of Change captured the spirit of hope and transformation that would eventually lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Throughout the Cold War, music served as a psychological tool that was harder to police and more powerful than any overt propaganda message. It crossed borders, broke down ideological barriers, and planted seeds of change in the hearts of those living under authoritarian regimes. Now, before I get into our next example, I just want to say, if you're enjoying this episode, it would mean so much if you could rate the podcast or leave a quick review wherever you're listening. It really makes a big difference in helping the Sound Mind reach more like-minded listeners just like you. Thank you so much for your support, and now on with the episode. Now, let's move away from the West to the Middle East. Let's talk about Iran and its journey from revolution to repression. This is another case where music has been used for both revolutionary mobilization and state control, and in fact, it's still going on today. Before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran had a thriving and diverse music scene, with a rich blend of traditional Persian music, pop, rock, and folk. The cultural landscape was as vibrant as any in the region, with artists drawing influence from both Western and Eastern traditions. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a central part of Iran's identity. As the political climate became more repressive, music began to reflect a growing dissatisfaction with the ruling, and musicians played a key role in voicing the sentiments of the Iranian people. One of the most prominent figures in this protest movement was legend Mohammad Reza Shajarian, a master of traditional Persian music. His songs often combined traditional melodies with lyrics that carried a clear revolutionary message. He and other musicians in the folk scene sought to unite the Iranian people through music, tapping into deep cultural pride while also criticizing the oppressive political system. The combination of poetic lyrics and powerful vocals created a sense of unity, giving voice to the frustrations of the people. These protest songs didn't just critique the government, they were an assertion of national identity, of Iran's history and heritage in the face of a foreign-backed regime that many had felt lost touch with the people. Due to his advocacy, his music was banned from being played in Iran, and he was also not allowed to release any new music in the country. This is an example of musical censorship and control that favors the government in power. He was so loved by the people, but censored by the government. He even did a Tiny Desk concert as well in 2013, which was just absolutely phenomenal. I really recommend you go and watch that just to see his pure musicality and how he's just able to capture the attention and soul of anyone that watches him or listens to him sing. I was absolutely amazed. However, the victory of the revolution brought about a significant shift in the role of music in Iranian society. With the establishment of the Islamic Republic, music was redefined as a potential threat to the state's morality and religious values. Under the new regime, many forms of music were seen as culturally inappropriate or even sinful, especially Western pop and rock, which were closely associated with the secular, westernized culture of the pre-revolutionary era. As part of a broader effort to impose strict religious laws, the government banned most forms of popular music, restricting music to what was considered appropriate, mostly religious and state-approved revolutionary songs. Music was no longer seen as a tool of personal expression, but as a tool of control and indoctrination. Revolutionary songs, or sarouds, were played from radios and televisions as well as loudspeakers, mosques, and streets across the country. These songs often had religious or nationalist themes, reflecting the fusion of Islamic ideology with a sense of Iranian pride and identity. During the Iran-Iraq War, the regime used music to glorify martyrdom and sacrifice. Particularly a song translated as "Muhammad, you weren't there to see it," honored fallen soldiers, and their mournful melodies and emotionally charged lyrics were designed to inspire a sense of religious duty and national pride. These songs were strategically used to recruit young men to fight, framing war as both a religious and national duty. The emotionally potent nature of these songs helped cultivate a culture of martyrdom, reinforcing the idea that dying for the nation was a noble and righteous cause. But despite the government's heavy-handed control over music, Iran's underground music scene remains active today. Musicians in this scene, often working in secrecy, continue to create music that defies state control and becomes a means of protest. This underground movement keeps the spirit of dissent alive through music, with songs expressing a desire for freedom, individuality, and resistance against oppression. Concerts in Iran are heavily regulated and controlled by the government. While public performances do occur, they're subject to strict censorship and often face limitations based on content. Concerts featuring Western music, popular genres like rock and pop, or performances by foreign artists are generally banned or require approval from government authorities. The government has imposed restrictions on the types of music deemed morally appropriate according to Islamic values, which often excludes secular or Western-style music. In recent years, there have been efforts to relax some of these restrictions. For example, some artists have been allowed to hold concerts, especially those focusing on traditional or classical music, and some concerts have taken place in venues such as Tehran's Vardad Hall. But performers and audiences still face the risk of censorship or punishment if their music is considered politically or socially inappropriate. In recent years, music has again played a vital role in Iran's protests. Following the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022, a young woman who died in police custody after allegedly violating Iran's strict dress code, protests erupted across the country. Music once again became a rallying cry, with artists using their voices to speak out against the injustice. One of the most powerful songs to emerge from these protests was Baraye by Shervin Hajipur. The song, which was inspired by the grief and anger of ordinary Iranians, was crowdsourced from social media posts by the public. The lyrics reflect the collective pain and frustration of the Iranian people, and the song quickly went viral, becoming an anthem of protest. Despite being banned by the Iranian government, Baraye spread across the globe, uniting people in its raw emotion and its call for change. Coldplay even performed it on tour to show their solidarity for the cause. The song, like the protests themselves, became a symbol of hope and resistance in the face of authoritarian control. The story of music in Iran is one of constant tension between state control and individual expression. For decades, the Iranian government has used music as a means of reinforcing its values and maintaining control over the population. But even in the face of strict censorship, music continues to be a powerful tool for resistance. It remains a means of expressing dissent, a way of uniting people in the fight for freedom, and an outlet for individuals to express their hopes and frustrations. Music, in this sense, reflects the ongoing struggle in Iran, a battle between state-imposed conformity and the human desire for self-expression and change. Now, I want to move on to our last case study, which also plays a current role, both China and North Korea. Both countries continue to use music as a powerful tool of state control, manipulating the cultural landscape to reinforce political ideologies and ensure loyalty to the leadership. Now, I grouped them together here because while these two countries do have different political systems, their use of music in shaping public consciousness remains strikingly similar, especially in promoting nationalism, loyalty to the state, and reinforcing their leaders' cults of personality. In North Korea, music is not only a form of entertainment, but a key part of the state's machinery for maintaining control. Under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un, music has been tightly controlled and constructed to serve the goals of the regime. Revolutionary songs and national anthems praising the Kim family have become central to North Korean identity. The Song of General Kim Il-sung and other works are regularly performed at state events and celebrations, showing the virtues of the leadership and the strength of the nation. These songs emphasize the idea of the Kim family as divine figures and the protectors of the nation. One of the most prominent uses of music in North Korea today is within the military and public spectacles. State-run operas and revolutionary plays which glorify the struggles against imperialist enemies are regularly broadcast. These works teach the population about the importance of loyalty to the leadership and instill a sense of collective national pride and duty. Songs praising the military play an integral part in solidifying the perception of North Korea as a nation constantly under threat, thereby reinforcing the need for the population to support the regime's ideology. As we've seen in most of these oppressive states, the underground music scene serves as a contrast to the official state-sponsored narrative. Despite strict censorship, North Koreans are increasingly finding more ways to access and share banned foreign music, and some underground musicians continue to find creative ways to express dissent or a longing for freedom. However, such acts are highly dangerous, with the risk of imprisonment or even death. The crazy thing about North Korea is, music, of course, isn't the only art form being censored. It's everything, from movies to literature. In fact, there's a book called On the Art of the Cinema, written by North Korean leader Kim Jong-il, where he laid out his vision for film as a critical tool for ideological education. According to him, movies shouldn't just entertain, but instill unwavering loyalty to the party and its leaders. Film is actually one of the primary tools the North Korean government uses for propaganda. Every aspect of filmmaking, from the script to the final cut, is overseen by the state to ensure that it aligns with the regime's ideology and glorifies the ruling Kim family. Similarly, in China, music plays an essential role in reinforcing the power of the Communist Party and the leadership. While China's political system is more complex than North Korea's, the state's use of music for ideological control and national unity remains central to its political structure. During the Cultural Revolution, music became a key instrument in promoting Mao Zedong's ideology, with revolutionary operas and songs composed to glorify the Communist Party and the struggle against capitalist forces. These operas replaced traditional Chinese cultural forms, aligning the arts with the party's political agenda. In modern China, music continues to serve as a state tool for promoting national pride, often centered around the concept of self-reliance and loyalty to the party. Today's Chinese music scene includes a blend of patriotic songs, martial anthems, and music that glorifies China's power and economic might. Nationalistic songs and state-controlled performances are regularly showcased during public celebrations, particularly around national holidays like the National Day. Music plays a significant role in instilling a sense of pride and loyalty to the state, and in presenting China as a powerful, unified nation under the strong leadership of the Communist Party. A key part of China's musical propaganda today are the Red Songs, a genre of songs that emerged during the Chinese Revolution and are deeply tied to Maoist ideology. These songs, characterized by their patriotic themes, are frequently performed at public events, rallies, and schools. They praise the Communist Party, glorify the achievements of the revolution, and promote the enduring legacy of Mao Zedong. Red songs remain popular in modern-day China as part of efforts to remind the population of the party's revolutionary roots and to unify citizens around a common national identity. The state-run media often broadcast these songs as part of a broader campaign to foster patriotism and ideological alignment with the party. Just as North Korea uses music to reinforce its leader's cult of personality, China does so through promoting songs that praise President Xi Jinping's leadership and the party's vision for the future. Music is also used to promote unity and nationalistic values, especially in the face of perceived external threats. For instance, music celebrating China's military achievements or economic triumphs is frequently broadcast during times of heightened tensions, such as during territorial disputes. The state-sponsored use of music in both North Korea and China shows how totalitarian regimes, both historical and contemporary, can manipulate cultural values to further enrich their control over society. Music is an effective tool because it emotionally resonates with people and is deeply integrated into public life, making it a highly influential form of propaganda. In both countries, the control of music serves not only to unify the population, but also to suppress dissent by presenting a singular narrative and by creating an atmosphere where loyalty to the regime is constantly reinforced. The presence of underground movements in both nations, but also in Iran and all other places historically, highlights the ongoing struggle between state control and individual expression, with music often acting as a subtle form of resistance. But oftentimes, it's not just music that has an impact, but the artists themselves. Musicians hold powerful influence beyond their songs. They're cultural icons, role models, and in many cases, trusted voices for millions of people. Political campaigns across the world have long recognized this, strategically leveraging the backing of popular music artists to sway public opinion and gain votes. When a well-known artist endorses a candidate or a political movement, their fanbase can feel personally connected to that cause, as though supporting the artist means supporting the values that they promote. This can translate into widespread mobilization, increased voter turnout, and the amplification of political messages that might not otherwise reach certain demographics, especially younger audiences who tend to be more engaged with pop culture than traditional political discourse. We've seen this tactic at work in democratic elections, where artists headline rallies or use their social media platforms to encourage political participation. Think of how musicians like Beyoncé, Taylor Swift, or Kendrick Lamar have spoken about political issues, encouraging their followers to register to vote or take a stand on social justice matters. Their words and actions really carry weight, not just because of their celebrity status, but because music creates emotional bonds. Fans often feel a deep sense of loyalty to artists whose songs have shaped their lives, making them more receptive to the political messages those artists endorse. But it's not always so clear-cut. In some cases, the artist's influence can blur the lines between entertainment and propaganda. Endorsements can sometimes lead to uncritical acceptance of a political agenda, where celebrity charisma overshadows the need for informed debate. In more controlled or authoritarian regimes, artists may be pressured or even coerced into publicly supporting state ideologies, turning their cultural capital into a tool of manipulation rather than genuine advocacy. This intersection of music, celebrity, and politics shows how complex and powerful this relationship can be. It's a reminder that we, as listeners and fans, should remain aware of how influence works. Music can move us emotionally, but when artists step into the political arena, their influence can also shape beliefs, behaviors, and even the future of nations. Wow, what an episode! We've covered a lot of ground today, diving into the complex role of music in political warfare and propaganda. From the battlefields of World War II to the streets of Tehran and beyond, music has proven itself to be far more than just entertainment. It's been a powerful tool for control, a vehicle for resistance, and a language that transcends words. Whether it's regimes using it to solidify power or ordinary people turning to it to spark change, music is always charged with emotion. It can unite us, inspire us, and even shape the course of history. Ultimately, I hope that today's episode has opened your eyes to the darker possibilities of music. While music is often celebrated for its power to uplift, connect, and heal, we must also acknowledge its ability to be weaponized for more sinister purposes. By understanding the darker side of music, we can better appreciate its true power and potential and work to ensure that it's used for the greater good. Thank you so much for joining me today on The Sound Mind. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who might find it interesting. It's definitely a topic that I bet many people haven't thought so obviously about and could really open up some interesting discussions. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. And also, come and say hi on Instagram at The Sound Mind Talks. I always love to hear from you. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on The Sound Mind.